Want to keep your dollars and cents? Then download the Sense app from the Office of Financial Readiness. That's Sense, S-E-N, money sign, E, to save for retirement, build credit, create a spending plan, or buying a home. You can't do any of those things without money. So if you have sense, you'll download the Sense app. That's S-E-N, money sign, E, today. And be sure to follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Great Power Competition, or GPC. For some, this term has come to represent the decline of U.S. dominance and influence around the world. Essentially, we have allowed other powers to become equally as great as that of the U.S. But for others, great power competition means returning to a 9/11 readiness posture. But what does that even mean? And how will this affect the missions of Special Operations Forces? Jack Murphy takes us into Great Power Competition.
Here on Military Matters, we recently released a 3-part series about the rise of China and the security implications to the United States that arise from this geostrategic competition between our two countries. In this episode, we'll take a closer look at what this means for the Department of Defense as it attempts to transition away from counterterrorism towards so-called great power competition.
When the 2018 National Defense Strategy was released, the term that came into vogue, as I'm sure you know, was great power competition.
Dr. Schroden holds a PhD and directs the Special Operations Research Program for CNA, a nonprofit research and analysis organization.
The idea that, according to then Secretary of Defense Mattis, that counterterrorism was no longer going to be the priority for the Department of Defense, and instead it was going to revert to competition with, other great powers. The question that then arose, though, was, well, what does that mean? What is the understanding the great power piece is pointing to Russia and China primarily, but what does competition actually mean? And more recently, with the advent of the Biden administration, they've now moved on from great power competition and are using the term strategic competition, which some have argued is even less clear and more nebulous than before. But nonetheless, it begs the question, what do we mean by competition? Now, of all of the forces that DoD has, they've been the most focused on counterterrorism. And so this idea that the priority now of the Department of Defense needs to shift away from that to something else labeled competition, I think is most impactful on SOF, because in part, they're going to be asked to continue to sort of hold the line on countering terrorist groups. But at the same time, they can't just double down or completely remain foresighted on that problem, right? There is pressure from the Pentagon on the likes of Special Operations Command to identify ways that SOF can contribute to strategic competition. And the question really is, what does that mean? What roles should SOF play within that context? And the lack of definition as to what we mean by competition is really hindering it. The second major thing I would point to, though, is there is internal resistance from within the SOF community to that type of pivot. And here I see that more like less at the leadership level and more at the level of actual special operators who are in a lot of ways quite comfortable with the mission set of counterterrorism. There's an entire generation now of special operators who know only that, have known only that, are comfortable with even the pace of deployments, which is quite high, are comfortable with that. And so there's this cultural resistance inside the SOF enterprise to move too far away from that and to focus on, again, this sort of nebulous, undefined competition set of missions that is not crystal clear to everybody, like, what does that actually mean, right? The unknown is always scary to people, no matter who they are.
Do you think there's something to be said, though, for maintaining the counterterrorism mission? I heard, I believe it was General Nagata during congressional testimony not so long ago, saying that we could still be facing terrorist organizations that are state-sponsored, like we did during the Cold War. The KGB had some association with some of the Palestinian groups, and there's always that lingering question, can state actors use terrorism as a sort of veneer to, hold us down, bog us down strategically?
I think the short answer is yes. And I would broaden the aperture, not just terrorism, but proxy groups and surrogates in general. And these can be non-state groups. We tend to think of as insurgent groups or terrorist groups, but they could also be, private companies like the Wagner Group, right? Private military contractors, or they can be other, sort of pseudo-government entities that are used in ways to create those types of problems. And I think there's a lot of reticence, and for good reason, to cast the type of strategic competition that we're talking about as a sort of new Cold War with the likes of China, right? And the conditions are very, very different between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so I can appreciate the reticence of sort of dragging that framing back into the present. But nonetheless, I think one of the useful aspects of that analogy is that great powers don't tend to want to get into military conflicts directly with each other because the costs of doing so tend to be exorbitant. And so instead, there's a temptation to slug it out through the use of proxies and surrogates and, those types of organizations in theaters that are of secondary importance to the great powers. Right. And so
Afghanistan, Angola.
So what might those be? Right. South and Central America, Africa, Central Asia. Right. I mean, these are the theaters that are arguably of secondary importance to the likes of the United States and China. And so I see a lot of threats and dangers, if you will, to U.S. national security from the likes of those activities. But there's also a lot of opportunity there, I think, for the likes of SOF.
Is that to sort of answer the question of the role in SOF moving forward as they, in the theaters of so-called great power competition? Is that what you see their role as being in the, dare I say, I mean, even a sort of repeat of what was sometimes called the Third World War, or the war in the Third World, since the United States and the Soviet Union didn't want to square off directly, as you said, we end up fighting in these sort of, third countries, around the world.
Yeah, it's tempting again to sort of reapply that framework. The one difference I would say in the modern world is this isn't true across the board, but I think it's more true than it's not. The countries that we're talking about in these quote unquote secondary theaters are in a lot of ways much stronger now than they were during the Cold War, right? And so the idea that you could just go launch a proxy war in Central America or, some part of sub-Saharan Africa today, I think would offend a lot of audiences. And I think practically speaking, you would have a harder time doing that because there are stronger governments and militaries, et cetera, in these countries. And so I don't know that the competition will be as kinetic as it might have been during the Cold War. I tend to think of it more as certainly there will be large economic aspects of this, but I tend to think of security assistance, security cooperation, right? Those types of building partner capacity type efforts are going to be even more important going forward, I think, than in the past because they are non-kinetic ways of generating partnership, of generating access, of generating influence in these countries that are, again, that are going to be areas of competition between the likes of the U.S. and other great powers.
So you see the Foreign Internal Defense Mission as kind of really coming to the forefront in the coming decades?
Yeah, I think FID, Security Force Assistance, SFA, potentially unconventional warfare in some unique circumstances, but probably more than UW would be counter UW. Which, right, in order to counter it, you need to understand it yourself. So I think SOF will still need to train to the UW mission, if not for conducting it themselves, but for countering it in various other locations. And so those missions, I think, especially for special forces, right, the Green Berets, I think are going to come screaming back to the forefront in the years to come.
I also want to ask you a bit about what is the sexier mission in this context, beyond, capacity building and diplomacy and some of the other things that, our military will likely aid in, which would be strategic sabotage and some of the operations that, the guys still train for today. But, we can look back to the past with Special Forces Detachment A, where you had Green Berets who lived off of the economy, wore plain clothes. They were not in uniform. And they conducted their missions in a clandestine manner. Do you think that's something you could see happening again? Do you think special forces can recapture that type of mission set and that type of capability?
I do, although probably in very limited quantities. Right? I mean, we've got 70,000, the Special Operations Enterprise is now about 70,000 people. Not all of those are operators, but, many tens of thousands of special operators. To think that that's going to be a mission that tens of thousands of special operators get involved in, I think is pretty bold and unrealistic. But, some very small number of likely the elite of the elite of the elite, if you will, I think we'll move in more into that space. Now, when it comes to specifically doing sabotage, we did a study, my team at CNA recently, that looked at the history of maritime sabotage, which was the first time that had ever been really looked at in depth in a single study. And one of the things we found is that there are very few examples, at least in the unclassified, open source world, which is where we had to do this study. There were very few examples of maritime sabotage that was conducted outside the context of a large-scale conflict, right? And so one of the things that emerges is, at least historically, sabotage seems to be an option that becomes attractive when you're involved in a total war setting, where you don't have to worry so much about the political ramifications of the types of things you do because it's total war, so everything is on the table.
Are you a military spouse? MilSpouse Money Mission educates and empowers those whom service members rely on most. So if you're the household 6, captain of the homestead, leader of the domicile, check out MilSpouse Money Mission from the Office of Financial Readiness. Also, they have an app, Sense app, SEN money sign E, to save for retirement, build credit, create a spending plan, or buying a home. If the last year taught us anything, it was how important it is to save for a rainy day or a COVID year. So if you have any sense, you'll download the Sense app. That's SEN money sign E today. And be sure to follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.
So you had stay behind, unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare to start with in the beginning during the Cold War.
Let's flip it over to Bob Charest to get some perspective from his point of view. Bob served in Special Forces where he saw action in Vietnam, but he also served in a highly secretive clandestine unit in Berlin known as Detachment A, where he and his teammates worked to deter the Soviet Union by living undercover and planning sabotage missions.
The stay behind mission was when we sent 4 teams from Bad Tolz, Germany, 10 Special Forces, to Berlin because command realized that the Soviets were definitely trying to take over, so they needed something, a deterrent. So they sent 4 teams initially from Bad Tolz, Germany, 10 Special Forces, to Berlin. That later expanded to 6 Special Forces teams, and the mission required stay behind. When we say stay behind, we went up there, civilian clothes, long hair, no association with the other troops in Berlin Brigade at all. We were strictly in the city all the time. We had assigned targets to us. If something happened, we were to stay behind and make sure that these targets got hit. Demolitions was very heavy in them days because it involved a lot of demolitions on the rail line surrounding Berlin. It was designed to deny the Russians from advancing with the record speed. We were to slow them down. This was our direct action mission and a stay behind mission.
So the idea was that you guys would blend in with the population if the Russians ever invaded and then activate and conduct acts of sabotage to slow them down.
Absolutely. Like when I got there, when I got there in 69, it was still, you were in coat and tie just like all the civilian population. You had your hairstyle was the same as theirs. All your clothes were German clothes. You were issued a Deutschmark fund when you first got to Detachment A. You went downtown on the Kurfürstendamm and KaDeWe, which was like a Sears store. You had X amount of marks. You went in there and you bought even your underwear, your socks. your tie, your jacket, no Sears and Roebuck stuff. You did blend in very well. Our language capability worked very well. We knew the transit system backwards, the U-Bahn in Berlin and stuff like this, and we could communicate using dead drops, live drops, PMPs like this and stuff. It was a very, very clandestine mission, and it worked extremely well in the early days.
So with that in mind, what do you think about special forces trying to sort of recapture some of that and recapture the unconventional warfare mission today?
It's going to be extremely hard today because you do have to, each special forces detachments or units are designed to go into the country and stay behind, live with the population, learn the population that you're in there with. And to do that today, we're restricted in a lot of ways because of the current military situation. It's kind of like we're shrinking up. We cannot get in there like we want to, like in Berlin, Detachment A, you had plenty of time. You had the assets is the most important. We had the most important asset of all was the LAJAK folks. They lived in Germany. They were East Germans, ex-Russians, ex-Poles, ex-Czechoslovakians. It worked very well because they taught us how to smoke a cigarette. They have a certain style on holding a cigarette, and you have to learn on utensils when you're in a guest house on how to use them. And today, I don't see that. I think it's going to be very difficult for the special forces and their future missions, and I don't know what the answer is, but it's not looking too good.
Do you think there are some lessons that can be taken away from Detachment A or maybe even Detachment K in Korea, as far as, being there long term and embedded with the locals and just kind of like looking at that mission over a longer time horizon?
Yeah, but where can we use that today, Jack? We're not. We withdraw from every country we go into now, and we lose the initiative right away. Like when we retreated from Afghanistan, okay, all SF troops were pulled out.
Yeah.
They had completely no support, no more support. And without air support, the A-team living out there with those indigenous people, the tribes and stuff like this, they don't have a mission no more. And so the future, I can't see what's coming. I think everybody in the Special Forces community is waiting to see what the command does and stuff like this. But right now, I don't think anybody's got an answer. We don't know what direction we're going to be used for, and and where are we going to be used anymore. We're just withdrawing all our unconventional warfare forces from their missions.
It seemed that Bob and John tended to agree that this is not simply a repeat of the Cold War, and that the old tactics, techniques, and procedures cannot be reapplied today as if we are facing the same conflict. There are political considerations and questions of escalation which apply differently today than they did 50 years ago. Here's what John had to say about some of these complications.
The few examples we found of maritime sabotage taking place in a not total war setting typically engendered significant political repercussions. And so that really is the question, I think, for not only sabotage, but the types of heavily clandestine activities that you sort of alluded to. That will be the challenge in a competition environment, is to what extent do you think you can do those things and either get away with them or do them in such a way that if they get exposed, that they don't lead to massive escalation. Because that's something that I think the SOF and I would say DoD more broadly have fallen out of practice in terms of thinking about escalation with respect to other adversaries. I mean, especially if you think about terrorist groups and the focus on counterterrorism for 20 years, terrorist groups could escalate as far as they could possibly go against the U.S., and we could always out-escalate them further. So you didn't really have to worry about escalation ladders and, the results of things that you would do so much. But when you focus on a state adversary like China, escalation becomes extremely important very quickly. Especially when you're talking about things like strategic sabotage, right? How they respond to that were it to become discovered, or if they even suspected that you were behind it, becomes very, very important. And I'm not convinced we have as detailed understandings of that as we would like.
And I realize it sounds like almost like something out of a movie, but in a total war situation, do you think that's still a possibility that you could see like combat diver teams on those small islands that the Chinese have occupied in the South China Sea, that strategic sabotage would be a part of the battle plan?
In a total war scenario, yes. I think everything becomes on the table then. What I find more interesting to think about is if the U.S. were to get into a limited war with China, for example, over Taiwan, or, something else happened in the Pacific that led to sort of a regional war that was largely contained to the Pacific. And certainly we could argue about the likelihood of something like that occurring or even remaining contained in the Pacific. But those are the types of scenarios I think that are interesting to think about because it's limited. And the U.S. would not want to be in a situation where escalation is left to occur unchecked in a limited war, right? And so, again, questions of strategic sabotage then become issues of, well, to what extent does that fall within the escalation ladder? Is it, viewed as a sort of tit for tat aspect? It would depend largely on what the Chinese did and what we thought the political fallout might be for other countries in the region, right? So there's a lot of considerations that come in. The bottom line, I think, is that SOF will need to be prepared to conduct those types of missions. And then it will be up to their political masters to decide if and when they ever get the green light to do them.
So on like more of on a soldier level, how do you think special operations is going to grasp with these cultural changes that they're going to have to go through? One troop I spoke to said, the name of the game now is readiness. And none of us really know what readiness means. We're just told to be ready.
And again, there's real reticence in some quarters, to scaling back the pace of deployments, right? So the idea that you would really, no kidding, get to a deploy to dwell situation where for every 6 months that an operator is deployed, they've got a year before their next deployment. That's a situation that the SOF enterprise hasn't had for 15 years. And so that's creating some consternation amongst some parts of the force, right? They feel like they're not being used enough. They're bored when they're at home station. And the idea that you would, go back to the way that, for example, JSOC used to operate, where it was totally a deploy for purpose organization. And when it wasn't deployed for purpose, it was training, right? And same for other parts of the SOF enterprise. You weren't in this cycle where you did a 6-month, workup, you deployed for 6 months, then you came back and you were off deployment for 6 months or whatever, and then you would go deploy again. The idea that you would get off this never-ending hamster wheel of deployments and instead do a workup and then be sort of on call, right, and to just continue to train. That idea that you wouldn't actually deploy after your workup cycle, I think, is really anathema to a lot of operators these days.
Yeah.
And they really don't like that idea. That they wouldn't deploy somewhere. And so that then begs the question of, well, what do you let drive the frequency and conduct of missions? Do you let the national interest drive those things, or do you let your training cycle drive how many deployments you're putting out and where you're sending people, right? So there's this view that, like, well, the bottom up needs to be serviced, right? Or else you're going to lose operators because they get bored and they want to go do something else. And I tend to take the view that, we can't let the training cycle drive deployment cycles and drive strategy, right? I mean, that needs to come from the top down, and then you've got to create training and deployment cycles that marry to the national interest and the national needs. And we haven't quite gotten there yet. And again, right, some of this is because the competition mission is so ill-defined that I don't think SOCOM and the SOF enterprise have gotten the type of guidance they really need to then align their training programs and cycles to service that national intent. So there's a real mismatch right now between strategic direction and, tactical level training and deployment cycles.
I had to ask Bob what he thought of all of this.
And me and you and other special forces troops, having been there, done that, we're taking a look today. We just can't see. We've lost the initiative, is what I see. we have really lost the initiative. Because if you don't have a stay-behind mission in special forces, you're not going to do your job. We're not designed to go fly in, knock doors down, and take over a village of that anymore, because that involves a lot of support, and we don't have anything right now. We don't know. Everybody's back at Fort Bragg or Florida or out in Colorado with a tent. They're all sitting back now going, what's next? And nobody's addressing this.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Do you have any thoughts on that, on what that direction could be as far as confronting Russia and China today, and how special forces could be of use there?
I don't think that is part of an unconventional mission for special forces today. When you're confronting Russia and China, this is conventional, not unconventional. It's going to involve a lot of planning, a lot of direction, a lot of troop strength. You got to have somebody in power backing you. And right now, look at us. We don't have that. And right now, like I keep saying, I don't see a future that we're going to be involved with. It's almost like when Vietnam fell. Okay, special forces, everybody was full back and all this kind of stuff. And immediately command decided they didn't need special forces anymore. So they started reducing the groups. They started reassigning all the NCOs to re-enlistment positions, ROTC jobs and stuff like this, and cutting out some of the groups. I think this is possibly going to happen. I don't know. Because right now we don't have a mission anywhere. And we cannot face Russia or China. I mean, the next confrontation is not going to be unconventional warfare. It's going to be a war.
The last thing I would highlight, I think, is a challenge for special operations leaders, which comes to retention. And it flows from what we just talked about, where if you change that paradigm to where operators aren't getting the numbers and, types of deployments that they want, not doing the things they're interested in, especially if that's counterterrorism relative to other things, there's this real fear among SOF leaders that they're going to start to attrit operators, and they're going to have retention issues down the line. And I can appreciate that fear and that concern, but I also don't think you can let it drive what you do with the future direction of the SOF enterprise, right? I mean, if the people who are in the force today don't want to be doing the missions that the force needs to do going forward, then, as sort of cold as it sounds for me to say this, you have to let them go, right? I mean, they need to go find something that they will enjoy doing, and you need to move the enterprise in the direction that it needs to go to service the national interest, with the belief that you'll be able to recruit new people who will be interested in the missions that you need the force to do going forward. And that's easy for me to say because I'm not the commander of SOCOM, but it's something that will probably need to be done. And I know it's something that SOF leaders are wrestling with day in and day out right now.
These are issues that are going to continue to haunt the Department of Defense for many years. And clearly, they need some definitive guidance from policymakers as to what their mission or missions are going forward, and what conflicts they need to be on call to respond to. Otherwise, the troops at the ground level are just confused as to what their purpose is and what their training is intended for. It leads to a lot of frustration. And as we discussed, even downsizing and soldiers deciding to separate from the military because they don't get what the point is anymore. But there is a point. America is facing as big a threat today as it ever has in this century. But that needs to be articulated to the force as something more than just another nebulous threat in a forever war.
Huge thanks to Dr. John Schroden and Bob Charist for their expertise and insight on the subject of great power competition. What do you think about this story? Send us your emails to militarymatters@stripes.com or find us on Twitter @StripesMMPod and leave us your thoughts and feedback. Don't forget to visit us at stripes.com and get 50% off your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes when you use promo code PODCAST. That's 50% off when you use promo code PODCAST. Stars and Stripes has been there for you every step of the way, every deployment, no matter how far away you've been. Now you can bring the news that matters to you right to your phone, to your laptop. Go to stripes.com and use promo code PODCAST. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
We'll see you at the next episode. Did you know that the Office of Financial Readiness has an app? Download Sense app. That's S-E-N $E. Sense app has the information you need for saving for retirement, building credit, creating a spending plan, or buying a home. FinRed has the tools you need. Download Sense app for tips on the go and follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.